There's an impeccably restored AVRO Lincoln B2 aircraft sitting pride of place in a hangar at the Royal Air Force Museum Midlands in Cosford. At first glance, she looks like any other historic bomber from the Second World War, albeit representing the peak of piston engine, propeller-driven aerial warfare just before jet engines took the reins. But there's something unusual about this specific Lincoln, with a serial number of RF398, that sets her apart from others. Both visitors and staff have reported strange things around the plane. Shadows moving when no one's there, eerie footsteps echoing in the empty hangar, and the disembodied sounds of a crew at work. Some say the plane is haunted, perhaps by the spirit of a pilot who once flew her, but no one knows for sure. Is it just imagination, an elaborate hoax concocted by museum staff, or is this RAF bomber really hiding a ghostly secret? The site of RAF Cosford, where that Lincoln is now on display, that has its own history too though, stretching back to the 1930s. The RAF was going through a period of rapid expansion, and as it was growing, it needed more pilots and technicians. And so in 1938, conveniently just a year before the Second World War started, Cosford was chosen as the site for a new school of technical training. Here, armourers, radar technicians and engine and airframe fitters were trained as part of the RAF apprentice scheme, supplying the skill needed to keep the RAF in the air throughout World War II. After 1945 though, once the war was over, the operation was scaled down, but it was still very much needed as we entered into the age of jet-powered aircraft and, of course, the Cold War. And training is still going on to this day. It still plays a huge part in the RAF's Defence College of Technical Training. Alongside that, the Midlands Air Ambulance is also stationed here, and if you've ever heard of Cosford Air Show, believe it or not, it's hosted at RAF Cosford, which as a side note started out as just an open day in 1978 to celebrate the base being open for 40 years, but it turned into this huge world-renowned public event that's still held there to this day. And of course, the museum at Cosford, that's been there since 1979, where they put on display some of the aircraft that they had been used for training. And the museum itself, that's just grown from strength to strength too. It's got hangars full of planes, different exhibits, just a great informative day out. It's also got a pretty impressive claim to fame going on for it as well, as it's the only place in the UK where you can see all three of the famous V bombers, the Vickers Valiant, the AVRO Vulcan, and the Handley Page Victor. And so you can see why aviation enthusiasts or people with just an interest in history and planes would have a great time there. And I'd love it without the story I'm about to tell you about. I just love seeing planes. Terrified of flying, but I love planes. Make it make sense. But it's the predecessor to these strategic jet-powered bombers which attracts a different type of visitor. Perhaps a visitor with more of an enthusiasm for the paranormal? And we're easy to spot. Just look for the people that are making a beeline for the AVRO Lincoln B2 bomber, RF398. And a bit of a backstory on the Lincolns as well. They were built by the AVRO aircraft company, hence the name AVRO. And they were meant to take the place of the Lancaster bomber, which had dominated all through World War II. But the RAF had needed an aircraft that had the range to handle the front lines in the Pacific. So the Lincoln was built and actually took to the skies for the first time in June 1944. Problem was, even though they had now come up with this solution to a problem they were having, there is still a war on. There is still a need for prioritisation for materials, production, all of that. And so they needed to maintain a supply of Lancasters to keep up with that demand. It was already a proven aircraft, it had been used all through the war, so that's the aircraft that they prioritised. And so it wasn't until August 1945 that the Lincoln finally got into the hands of the RAF pilots. Victory in Europe Day, the day that the Nazis surrendered to the Allied forces, was on the 8th of May 1945. Okay, no worries, there's still a conflict going on in Japan, right? Japan surrendered on the 15th of August 1945, and so the Lincolns never actually saw service in World War II. Still, 583 Lincoln bombers were built and they were used in the 50s against the Communist Malayan National Liberation Army, and then again against the Kenya Land and Freedom Army during the Mau Mau Rebellion. But from about 1955, the V-bombers had taken the Lincoln's place. They were still used in radar development trials up until about the 60s, but after that, they were phased out completely. And so our infamous RF398, she took her first flight on the 11th of September 1945, and for the next few years went through a bunch of different modifications until 1952, where she joined the Bomber Command Bombing School, which, as the name suggests, was where bomber crews were trained to fly and operate these aircraft and their payloads. After the Lincolns were phased out though, on the 30th of April 1963, RF398 was taken on her final flight, where she flew from RAF Watton to RAF Henlow in Bedfordshire to go into storage ready for the eventual opening of the museum, because it was already in the pipeline. They already had this plan for a public museum way back in the 60s. She was originally going to go to Hullivington so that they could preserve her, ready for her to go on display, but for whatever reason that didn't happen, and so by 1968 she was in need of some TLC, which she got. A lot lot of people worked hard to keep her in good condition. And in the late summer of 1968, she was finally transported to Cosford, where she has remained ever since. By the late 70s, she was again in need of restoration work. This is the thing with these aircraft. The way that they're manufactured, what they're manufactured from, how they're used, where they're stored, all of these things result in natural wear and tear, degradation over time, rust, corrosion, components failing, all of these things. And so they started another huge restoration project on RF 398, and it was during this project, in 1979, when the first paranormal reports allegedly started. Apparently, 2 engineers were working on the Lincoln late at night. They were the only 2 guys in the hangar at the time, when they claimed that they saw the figure of a pilot walking towards them. Initially, it's a bit like, okay, bit weird, you shouldn't be here, but are you good? How did you even get back here after closing, kind of thing? But before the engineers could say anything, the figure that was walking towards them vanished in front of their eyes. Rather quickly, they decided that it was time to call it a night. I think we've put in a good day's work. I think let's just pack up and leave now. So they did. They made sure to tidy away and then lock the hangar up behind them. They were the first ones back in the morning, but when they opened up the hangar, they walked in to find that the aircraft parts were all over the floor underneath the Lincoln. There is no way that they would have left a mess out like that. Maybe in their hurry they might have left 1 or 2 bits out, but there shouldn't have been the amount of parts on the floor that there was. A year later though, in 1980, another member of staff saw this figure again. And this story, I would have handed in my notice right there. I cannot think of a more pure, unadulterated source of nightmare fuel than this. They were just going around the hangar, closing down and locking up for the night, when they saw a dark figure moving around near the Lincoln. Immediately, their first thought is, oh, there's a guest who's sneaking around past closing, or there's someone doing some maintenance work. We should probably check either way. So they switch the lights back on, ready to go and see who they are. In the light, the figure disappears. Okay, we were both definitely seeing a dark shadow of a person walking around over there. So I'm not super okay with this, but I guess that's it. So they just turn the lights back off again. And once the lights are off, there is the figure again, still walking around the bomber. Nightmare fuel. I always hated it when horror films did that. Like, you know, where you can't see anything in the light, so you turn the light off and then there's the monster. Can't do that. Don't like it. No thank you. Later that week though, there was a story about a mechanic who was working alone in the fuselage of the plane when he figured he needed a particular spanner. He'd heard the plane door open and footsteps walking up to him, and so without even looking, he just assumed it was one of his colleagues. So he shouted out to them, asking them to hand him the spanner that he needed. Without saying a word, the spanner was just thrust into his hand. Helpful, but who are you? Why are you giving me the silent treatment? So the mechanic looked to see whoever it was that had just handed him the spanner, only to find that he was still completely alone in the plane. And that's just on another level, isn't it? A ghost actually picking out the right spanner and putting some force into thrusting it into your hand. But apparently, that may not have been the story as it was meant to have been told. Because in my research, I came across a comment from a guy called Ian, who claimed to have been the mechanic that this story allegedly happened to. And he said that it didn't happen the way that it's been reported. Apparently, he was working in the rear gun turret and he'd just put a spanner down behind him after he was done with it. But when he got to go pack up, the spanner was completely missing. He'd searched for hours, could not find it anywhere, and so the disappearance was recorded in the logbook, because that's how they keep track of tools and things. After several weeks, this same mechanic was working on the RF 398 again, 30 feet away from the rear gun turret, nowhere near it, in the radio operator's compartment. And here there's a bench that covers the storage for oxygen bottles. He needed to get into this bit, so he'd remove the bench. And what does he see? Right there, as if it has always been there, is the missing spanner. No conceivable way that that spanner could have been kicked or knocked 30 feet into where he found it. So whether Ian's story is to be believed that the spanner went missing, or the one where the spanner is handed to the mechanic and that's the true story, either way, that is some very strange goings on, right? But it gets even stranger. There was one utterly unbelievable story, if I'm being honest, and it was about an electrician who was working on the Lincoln. He was working 15 feet up in the air, so not an insignificant distance, when he lost his footing and fell. Now this electrician, he had fallen before and hurt his back from a similar height to this, but he just knew that this one was going to be nasty when he landed. Like, it was going to be X's for eyes, game over. He braced for the impact, but just as he was about to slam into the floor, he stopped falling and floated down the last couple of feet super gently, almost as if something invisible had cushioned his fall. And the weird things apparently continued throughout the 80s. In 1984, a crew from ITV were filming a segment for the TV show Wish You Were Here, and so they got the presenter Chris Kelly all set up in the cockpit, and the cameraman was down on the floor filming him. The cameraman was getting irked though, as for some reason there was a guy all up in the cockpit with Chris Kelly ruining the shot. The cameraman called out to Chris, asking him to get the guy out of the cockpit. Chris turned around and was a bit like, there's no one here. The cameraman was adamant he could see this second person standing behind Chris, both through his camera viewfinder and when he looked up himself. Apparently this back and forth went for a few exchanges, like, he's there behind you, oh no he isn't, kind of thing, until the figure disappeared. Other reports from this time were coming out that people were again seeing this figure walking around, seeing mysterious lights inside the plane. There were also strange sounds heard that didn't seem like normal metal settling noises from the plane or even the hangar itself. And eventually these stories about all of this unexplained weirdness had spread, and so a researcher called Ivan Spenceley had approached the museum and asked to investigate the RF398, along with some other members of the Chesterfield Paranormal Research Group. He was given permission, and over the next 4 years, Ivan would visit the allegedly haunted bomber around 20 times, using a tape recorder to try and capture some of the unexplainable sounds. One night, the investigators had set the tape recorder up within the plane and walked away for 40 minutes. When they got back to the Lincoln though, they went inside to find that the lid of the tape machine had somehow been lifted, the 2 reels of tape removed, and then unspooled and just thrown around the cockpit, like someone had TP'd the cockpit with recording tape. But other times, the group had claimed that they'd captured something. They'd hear the noises of what sounded to them like strange taps, like switches being pulled, muffled voices, and even aircraft engines. Which, yeah, I know it's an RAF base and they do have an airfield and whatnot, but this is in the middle of the night, inside an aircraft that's inside a hangar, and no one else outside the hangar can hear these aircraft engine noises. Spenceley also claimed that he'd seen someone walking around the aircraft. He didn't see a full figure, but it's kind of like when someone is walking on the other side of the plane, you can just see their legs, but then when they should have come into full view, when like they get to the front of the plane, there's nothing there. In 1991, Ivan was joined by a BBC radio team for the recording of a Radio 4 show called Strange Stories: The Haunting of RF398, which was hosted by Gwyn Richards. And it was during this investigation where they captured some really strange sounds. The first bit of weirdness that they allegedly recorded was this clicking sound, almost again like someone playing around with the switches inside the plane. And then there was a very strange, almost whining sound captured. But that wasn't the only activity that night. Apparently, both Ivan and Gwyn saw at one point a really small light being shone around the rear gunner's compartment. It was moving around pretty dim, but it wasn't how you hear your stereotypical orbs being described. No flickering, almost like someone just had a little torch on the lowest setting and they were just sat in the dark turret moving the torch about. Which kind of gives me the creeps to think about, to be honest. That there might be someone hiding in that very dark corner that you can't see and they're just shining a little torch around in your eyes. No thank you. As an extra bit of post-investigation analysis, Gwyn and Ivan took the noise recordings to former airmen who used to fly the Lincoln to see if they recognised any of the sounds. And apparently they did. Phil Pritchett, Gareth Lewis and Peter Palmer claimed that those clicking noises were the exact same sequence of switches that a pilot and his crew would flick on or off as they were preparing to take off and then while they were up in the air. However, others who were a bit more sceptical about the sounds have said that it could have just been radar pulses from the AR-1 radar that's at the RAF station at Cosford. But the ex-Lincoln crew also had an explanation for the whining noise. They'd recognise it anywhere. They said that it was the noise that the navigational equipment known as console would have made. Thing was, the console in RAF 398 hadn't been operational for years by the 90s, so why were those unmistakable sounds being picked up on the recorder? And just to top the whole thing off, they also found out that that little light that they maybe saw, yeah, that would have been something else that would have happened while the Lincoln was up in the air. The crew would use those little torches to see what they were doing, but they weren't too bright so that they didn't dazzle the pilot. So I'd say that was a more than productive paranormal investigation, right? Imagine capturing all of that with plausible explanations from ex-servicemen too. Sure, could still be explained away as random noises from an RAF station, but still interesting. After the BBC radio programme aired in February 1991, the museum was obviously inundated with requests from other paranormal investigators, desperate to get their own shot at capturing the ghost that appeared to be haunting the Lincoln bomber. But every single one of them got turned down, and as far as I can tell, no one has been allowed to do a proper at-night investigation of the aircraft since. Obviously no one is going to stop you from calling out, is anyone there, in the middle of the museum during opening hours. And you never know what might answer you back. But, you know, control conditions and all of that. Because Ivan really had tried to control as much as he could. When he left the tape recorder alone in the plane, he'd secure paper across the hangar door so that he'd know if anyone had been inside and contaminated the tape recorder. But in the years since Ivan's investigations, a lot of people have criticised his evidence that he captured, with even the founder of the Chesterfield Paranormal Research Group coming out and saying that his evidence and subsequent paranormal claims were, quote, entirely fraudulent. Do you know what added more fuel to that fire? When the museum staff came out and said that the whole thing had been a complete hoax, made up, fabricated, a sham, a ruse, a big fat fib. What? I know. What allegedly happened, and a bunch of people have come out and said that they were a part of this, was that the engineers had got word that the RF 398 was going to be leaving Cosford and going to another museum in Manchester. And they didn't like that. They thought that the Lincoln belonged at Cosford, so they concocted a ghost story to try and keep her at home. Because do you know why? Ghost stories sell. As word got out about this allegedly haunted bomber plane, visitors flocked to the museum, desperate to catch a glimpse of the ghost that the engineers had called Pete. At this point, there's no way that the museum higher-ups can let go of the RF 398 now. She's bringing in the crowds. And so that, my friends, is allegedly the true story behind the haunted AVRO Lincoln B2. And I know what you're thinking, oh, well that's a bit anticlimactic. Claire's bringing us a ghost story that turned out to be a complete hoax. What a letdown. Don't worry, there is more to this story. I wouldn't leave you hanging like that. Because regardless of all of these engineers coming out and saying, no, there's no such thing as ghosts around that plane, we made the whole story up, that hasn't stopped dozens of people from witnessing potentially paranormal activity around RF 398 right up to this day. To the point where, and this makes me giggle every time I think about it, the Facebook page for the RAF Museum Midlands actually put out a debunking video, basically going on record and saying that the story was categorically made up. And in the comments, people were just commenting their experiences on why they thought it was haunted. I just thought that was great. It made me smile. But so many people, even though it's all come out as a hoax, have apparently witnessed a figure walking around the plane, inspecting it, or sat in the cockpit, and he's always described as having fair hair and is dressed in either a pilot's battle dress or a white polo neck. When visitors notice him, sometimes they'll try and approach him, try to get his attention. He never interacts though, and he just vanishes before they can reach him. But there was a story from a guy who used to work at RAF Cosford, and he was very familiar with the story of this figure. He said that he'd most often see him when they were doing the rounds between 10 o'clock and midnight, and that whenever they saw him, he was always either in the navigator spot or in the right-hand pilot seat. They'd go to the AVRO Lincoln because you kind of gotta see if there is a person in there that shouldn't be in there. And this figure would look like he was hard at work, but on hearing the door open, he would look up at the guys where he'd smile at them before fading away into complete nothingness. Imagine seeing that at midnight in a dark hangar. That's gonna keep you awake, surely. Even new staff members who haven't heard the story about the bomber, they've seen this figure. And when they question their higher-ups about it, they're asked to describe what they saw. A fair-haired man in battle dress sitting in the cockpit, to which they're then told the story. But even if you don't see this figure, there are plenty of other strange things that have been reported in and around the aircraft. There's been whistling, tapping, even a man's singing voice heard within the plane. One cleaner who worked at the museum part-time said that they hated cleaning around the Lincoln because they would often hear the sounds of a radio crackling and they'd just get a horrible feeling while they were in there. And there was one time in the middle of the day when a visitor and his partner were in the Lincoln alone. There was no one else about and it was pretty quiet, and so they just asked out loud, "Is the pilot here with us?" They claimed that a distinct tapping noise within the cockpit answered their question. When the visitors took a step back, obviously they were pretty shocked. It seemed like they just had an intelligent response. They looked up and saw a grey shadow floating around near the windows of the cockpit. One trainee once climbed into the cockpit of the Lincoln because I think it is actually blocked off so visitors can't go all the way inside, but he decided he was going and climbed right in. However, he very quickly climbed right back out as something had creeped him out. He said that as he was sat in there looking around, he felt a very noticeable drop in temperature. Not a draft, not air conditioning, nothing like that. The air had just gone ice cold and he just got a bad feeling. Hairs on the back of your neck standing up. Something is going on. Could have been an overactive imagination, especially if he'd already heard the stories of the haunted bomber, but also maybe it wasn't. Even one of the former curators of the museum, Flight Lieutenant Derek Eastwood, he didn't specifically come out and say, oh yeah, there's definitely a ghost, but he also didn't exactly deny that there have been some weird things happen around the Lincoln bomber in the past that he just couldn't explain, but also that he wouldn't even pretend to understand what it was specifically. He even mentioned about a television crew who were filming around RF 398 one time, and they were all seemingly in good spirits, going about their work with a pep in their step, but it seemed like something didn't like their sunny disposition. Out of nowhere, one of their cameras was allegedly picked up by something invisible and thrown across the hangar. There was no one anywhere near the camera. It hadn't just toppled over. This thing had apparently been launched, which I'm sure dampened dampened the spirits of the crew somewhat, something invisible throwing their most likely pretty expensive gear around. And so with all of these strange things reported, surely that might make you think maybe, just possibly, there is something to the story of the haunted AVRO Lincoln B2, right? But what could it be? Why this plane? Because it's not like she's got battle scars from World War II. She wasn't built in time to see service. And even after World War II, the bomber had only had a couple of actual combat missions. No one was reported to have died on the air crash, she didn't crash, nothing like that. So what's going on? There is one story that a lot of people believe could be the source of the hauntings. Because apparently, and I'm just going to tell you the story as it is for now, there was a pilot called Major Hiller. RAF people who have already noticed the glaring error of what I've just said, don't scream at me, we're going to come back to it, I promise. But this guy Hiller, he was said to be extremely fond of RF 398, he absolutely adored her. Hiller took the Lincoln for her last flight in 1963 and he was pretty gutted. He didn't want to part with this plane. And so he was allegedly quoted as promising that he would come back after his death and, quote, haunt his baby. That's how much he loved this aircraft. The story goes on to say that obviously because the Lincoln wasn't in service anymore, Hiller was transferred onto Dove aircraft. However, not too long after his transfer, he was involved in a fatal crash not too far away from RAF Cosford. And because it was so close, part of the wreckage of that Dove aircraft had been transported back to Cosford. And so, true to his word, he's apparently now the fair-haired pilot that's been seen haunting his baby, the AVRO Lincoln B2 bomber. ... Allegedly. So, first of all, now, I'm not a military expert, so I don't know if I'm missing anything. Let me know if I am. But from what I can see, there is no rank of major in the RAF. So he couldn't have been Major Hiller. Second, there's no record of a Hiller piloting the Lincoln. And her last flight in 1963, the pilot was recorded as a Flight Lieutenant John Langley. But are you ready to hear the really super interesting and I don't think is a coincidence detail that I found out while I was trying to verify this story of Hiller's crash? So of course, the first thing I did, off I popped to the Aviation Safety Network database to try and find any fatal crashes within a reasonable vicinity of RAF Cosford involving a pilot called Hiller, who was also flying a de Havilland Dove plane, which would have made sense as to what he was transferred onto. I did not come across such a crash. But do you want to know what I did come across? There was one fatal crash involving a de Havilland DH-104 Dove Mark 8 that went down in Wolverhampton, about 10 miles away from RAF Cosford, on the 9th of April 1970. It was fatal. The pilot, co-pilot, and even a woman who was in the house that the plane crashed into, they were all killed. Do you want to know what the pilot's name was? Wasn't Hiller. No record of that name as far as I can see. His name was Captain John Eric Miller, and before he'd got his commercial pilot's license, he had been a pilot in the RAF. No records of him flying any Lincoln though, let alone RF 398. But come on, that's interesting, right? When I saw this crash, I did lean back in my chair and ruminate a little. Surely, the Lincoln ghost story and this particular crash, there's got to be some connection, right? Some way that the two have got mixed up together? Have the details just got muddied over time? Maybe Hiller's name was handwritten and someone mistook the H for an M and he got written down as Miller from then on? I don't know, that just doesn't feel quite right because from as far as I can see, Miller didn't have anything to do with Lincolns. Was it? And this one sounds a little bit more plausible, that the same museum staff who had made up the ghost story in the first place, they'd obviously needed to brainstorm an origin story for this ghost, and because this Dove crash involving Miller happened just down the road and not a huge amount of time ago, they decided to run with it and just change his name slightly. Something to think about. Let me know what you think, because that was just really interesting to come across. There's gotta be something to it, right? Let me know what you think. But in reality, we don't know who could be haunting the AVRO Lincoln B2 bomber at RAF Cosford. But whoever or whatever it is, it seems to be fairly friendly, pretty harmless aside from terrifying some visitors and staff every now and then. We're probably never going to get more answers either because as far as I know, the museum haven't allowed any more paranormal investigations and have no plans to in the future. At least the official properly locked down at night kind of deals since Evan Spenceley. But some people are convinced that it might not be specifically to do with the Lincoln and that it's the location that's haunted. A lot of people have heard footsteps in the hangars, which obviously they're pretty echoey, could just be someone on the other side. But there was a story of apprentices as part of the 128 entry who would help out late at night. So once the museum had closed and there was no visitors around, and they claimed to hear strange things, including footsteps on the roof of the hangar. One museum secretary, she was also busy putting up a notice board when she heard her name called out. Assuming it was just a colleague calling her for a tea break, she looked towards the door, but there was no one there. She scanned the whole hangar, not a soul, and certainly no reason why she would hear her name being called, clear as day. And it's not just the Lincoln's hangar we're talking about. There was one witness who claimed to hear two sets of footsteps walking near the Vulcan, which is an entirely separate hangar, but when they checked who was there, thinking that they'd locked someone in, they couldn't find a living person anywhere. Even the accommodation, the Fulton block, that's apparently got some stories around it. It was named after John Duncan Bertie Fulton, Fulton, who was a distinguished officer in the Royal Flying Corps and the Royal Field Artillery, and he served as the Chief Inspector of the Aeronautical Inspection Department during World War I before his death in 1915. He'd gone above and beyond in his service, so they'd named this block after him. Apprentices living in the Fulton block have apparently been woken up in the middle of the night to something they can't see, tucking them in, and apparently it's not their mates. But the story goes that it's the ghost of Lady Fulton, who was John's wife, but there's no evidence that he was even married, let alone that she was referred to as Lady Fulton, so not sure on that one. But if you have an interest in the paranormal and you're heading out to the Royal Air Force Museum Midlands, it's likely that you're going to be heading straight for RF 398 and hoping you catch her at a quiet time. So maybe you can call out and see if you can make contact with whoever may be haunting the aircraft. Unless you're not convinced, and the admission from the museum staff about it all being made up is enough for you to shut down the entire notion that this plane may be haunted. For me, I'm not going to dispute the fact that they made up this story. It's a widely known fact at this point. Lots of guys involved in the hoax have come forward, but there have been an awful lot of reports in the years since those initial stories came out pre-confession. No smoke without fire, maybe? Or it's just rumoured to be haunted, so why not play on the ghost story and use it to our advantage to keep the plane at Cosford? I can see both sides. As for who haunts the Lincoln, I haven't got the foggiest, no idea at all. But at the end of the day, whether it's all completely made up and these subsequent witnesses have just experienced an overactive imagination or something, the fact still remains that the ghost story did its job. It kept the Lincoln at Cosford. More visitors will be going to the museum because of the ghost story, which is obviously great for the museum. I mean, I wouldn't have come across the story if it wasn't for the Lincoln, so, you know, it's working. But let me know your theories, your opinions down below in the comments. I love reading through them all. The comments have slightly gotten away from me this month, but I do read through every single one. And while I was doing the research for this one, I came across so many other RAF stations and airfields claiming to be haunted, so we're definitely going to be coming back and doing more at some point. And if you have any suggestions for haunted airfields to start with, I want to know. And if you enjoyed this one, please do like the video. It is super helpful. And if you want to support me, the best way that you can is by making sure that you're subscribed, only if you fancy it, but it would be very cool of you if you did. Anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. I have a really itchy face today, man. I think I've got cat hair everywhere. There's definitely cat hair. I've probably like caked it in my makeup, and so now it's just in there.